Hello. Where did the religious tradition of circumcision, the phraseology of Sodom and Gomorrah, the story of the sacrifice of the son, and the first covenant between man and God originate? And many other cultural codes that influenced world culture and continue to surround us today. That's right, from the biblical story of Abraham. Earlier, we talked about the Abrahamic religions, namely what they are, and looked at the short history of their formation and interconnections. If you haven't seen the video about the Abrahamic religions yet, you can watch it via the link in the description. Today, we are going to talk about the figure of Abraham. As you know, Abraham is a biblical prophet who plays an important role in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In Judaism, he is the first person to make a covenant between the Jews and God, and the first Jew. In Christianity, he is the spiritual ancestor of all believers, regardless of their ethnicity. And in Islam, he is the father of the ancestor of the Arab people, Ishmael, and a link in the chain of Islamic prophets from Adam to Muhammad. We cannot consider the biography of Abraham in the same way as the biography of, let's say, Hermann Hesse or Alexander the Great. Because first of all, this person, if he lived in this world, lived a long time ago. It is impossible to even say exactly when. Scientists' interpretations of the time when Abraham lived vary greatly, from 2000 years BC to 500, that is from the 20th to the 5th century BC. In addition, the story of Abraham was passed down by word of mouth for hundreds of years, and only later was it written down. But the fact that we don't even know if Abraham lived, and if he did when, does not deny the great influence of this figure on the world we live in. So let's try to figure out what he did during his possible lifetime. Two sources of information help researchers to do this: the story of Abraham described in the Old Testament book of Genesis, and archaeological discoveries in the lands described in this book, as it tells not only about Israel, but also about Mesopotamia, because according to the Old Testament, Abraham was born in the Sumerian city of Ur and left it when he was 75 years old. Today we will not try to find out whether Abraham actually lived, because it is impossible. Let's take a closer look at the Old Testament story of Abraham and talk a little bit about his figure in the New Testament and the Qur'an, as well as in European philosophy. The story of Abraham is not one of the shortest in the Old Testament, so I will not read it in full, but will briefly retell it. Abraham was born in what is now Iraq, in the Sumerian city of Ur. There he married Sarah, his paternal sister. For a long time they lived in Ur of the Chaldees. Then Abraham moved with his father Terah, his nephew Lot, and his wife Sarah to Haran, northern Mesopotamia. In Haran, Abraham's father Terah died at the age of 205. Yes, the biblical years of life are impressive. God told Abraham to leave his father's house and to go wherever he said. He also promised that a great nation would come from Abraham. He also promised to bless Abraham himself and through him all the nations of the earth. This story of blessed descendants, which is repeated many times in the story of Abraham, is interpreted by Jews, Christians, and Muslims as a blessing to Jews, Christians, and Muslims respectively. After that, 75-year-old Abraham, together with his wife Sarah, his nephew Lot, all the property and people he had, left Haran and went to the land of Canaan. The Lord said that he would give this land to Abraham's descendants. Abraham built altars to God there, but eventually there was a famine in the land, so Abraham went to Egypt with Sarah and Lot. When Abraham arrived in Egypt, he asked Sarah to introduce herself as his sister, not his wife, because Sarah was beautiful and Abraham was afraid that Egyptians would kill him because of it. The Egyptians really liked Sarah, and Pharaoh took her as his wife. And Abraham, as the brother of such a beautiful woman, had plenty of cattle, menservants, and maidservants because of this. Then God punished Pharaoh with many misfortunes because he had taken Sarah, a married woman. Pharaoh asked Abraham why he had deceived him, and he sent Abraham, Sarah, Lot, and all that Abraham had acquired out of Egypt. And the company went into the Negev desert. Later, Abraham's shepherds and Lot's shepherds began to quarrel. Then Abraham and Lot decided to separate so that they would not quarrel over property. Abraham settled in Canaan, and Lot settled in the cities in the valley, pitching his tents as far as Sodom. Then God promised to give Abraham and his descendants all the land he could see. Then a war broke out between the local kings in the towns where Abraham's nephew Lot had settled, and Lot was taken prisoner. Abraham went to war against his nephew's enemies, defeated them, and freed Lot. Then Abraham had a vision in which God spoke to him. Abraham was complaining that he had no descendants, but God promised that Abraham would have a son and descendants as many as there were stars in the sky. So Abraham offered animals to God as a sacrifice. And then he had a dream in which God said that Abraham's descendants would be in captivity for 400 years, but then they would be released. This is a reference to the Egyptian captivity and Moses' exodus from Egypt. God then made a covenant or agreement with Abraham, promising the land from the Nile River to the Euphrates River to Abraham's descendants. However, despite God's promise of descendants, Sarah, Abraham's wife, did not bear him a child because she was barren. So she gave Abraham her Egyptian slave Hagar, hoping that she would give him a son. Hagar became pregnant with Abraham's child and began to treat Sarah lightly. Sarah, with Abraham's permission, began to oppress Hagar in return. So Hagar ran away. In the desert, she met an angel who told her to return to Abraham and Sarah and told her that she, Hagar, would give birth to a boy named Ishmael. When Abraham was 86 years old, his first son, Ishmael, was born. When Abraham was 99 years old, God appeared to him, promised him many descendants, and made a covenant with Abraham and his future descendants. God became their protector and gave them the land of Canaan, and all the men of Abraham's tribe were to be circumcised on the 8th day. The circumcision of the foreskin would be a sign of the covenant between God and Abraham's descendants. Anyone who is not circumcised will not belong to the people of Abraham in God's eyes. I would add here that Jews still circumcise boys on the 8th day because of this covenant. Muslims also keep the tradition of circumcision, although they are not strict about the age at which it should be performed. Christians, however, although they consider themselves descendants of Abraham, primarily spiritual descendants, do not practice circumcision except in some churches, because the New Testament, according to Christian tradition, actually makes the old covenant between people and God irrelevant, and therefore circumcision is not a prerequisite for salvation for Christians. Let's go back to Abraham. At the time of the covenant, God promised Abraham that Sarah would give birth to Yitzhak. Abraham obeyed God's will. All the males in his house, both those born in the house and those bought, were circumcised. Abraham was 99 years old when his foreskin was circumcised. Shortly after Abraham's circumcision, God appeared to Abraham in the form of 3 travelers. Abraham was looking for an opportunity to serve God, so he fed the travelers. God told them that he would come to Abraham again in a year and give him and Sarah a son. When Sarah heard this, she laughed, because she was very old and did not have her period. But God assured her that he would give her a son. Then God told again that Abraham had been chosen and that his children should keep the way of the Lord to do justice and righteousness. Then the Lord told Abraham that there was a cry in Sodom and Gomorrah, that there were serious sins being committed there. So he decided to go down there and see if it was true, and if it was true, to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. Then comes the famous dialogue between Abraham and God, where Abraham asks not to kill the whole city if there are righteous people there, so that they do not perish. And first, the Lord promised that if there were 50 righteous people there, he would not destroy the city. Abraham argued with God until the Lord agreed not to destroy the city if there were 10 righteous people there. 2 angels of God come to Sodom, and Lot invited them to spend the night in his house. The people of Sodom wanted to rape the 2 traveling angels. Instead, Lot offered the people of Sodom his virgin daughters. It sounds very strange, but let's not forget that these stories were written thousands of years ago, and the worldviews of the people of the Middle East at that time were quite different from those of people today who live in societies with different ethical standards. In response, the people of Sodom threatened to do evil to Lot. Then the angels intervened, blinded the angry crowd, and told Lot to take his family and flee the city, for the city would be destroyed for its sins. The angels led Lot, his wife and daughters out of the city and told them not to look back, lest they die. Then the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah began, with a rain of brimstone and fire. Lot's wife looked back and became a pillar of salt. By the way, there is a resonance here with another well-known mythical motif of looking back and death. Do you remember which one? The ancient Greek story of Orpheus and Eurydice. Orpheus looked back to see if Eurydice was following him out of the realm of shadows, and thus left Eurydice forever in Hades. But let's get back to Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot's wife became a pillar, Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, and Lot's daughters eventually became pregnant by Lot while he was sleeping, because they lived in seclusion and they were afraid that they would not have any descendants. So they gave birth to two nations, the Moabites and the Ammonites. As you can see, the mythic stories of the ancient Jews also explain the emergence of various Semitic nations. But let's go back to Abraham. After the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and Lot's departure from Sodom, Abraham temporarily settled in the city of Gerar. Once again, he introduced Sarah, his wife, to the locals as his sister. As in Egypt, the local king Abimelech took Sarah as his wife. But God appeared to Abimelech in a dream and told him that he was going to die because he had married a married woman. But Abimelech had not touched Sarah, so he was innocent in God's sight. Besides, he did not know that Sarah was married. God told Abimelech to give Sarah back to Abraham because Abraham was a prophet. If Abimelech did not return her, he would die. Abimelech called Abraham and later told the king that he was afraid that the people of Gerar did not fear God and would kill Abraham if they found out that Sarah was his wife, so they could have her. Besides, she was really his paternal sister, so he was not lying to the king. King Abimelech had mercy on Abraham and gave him back Sarah and gave him livestock, slaves, and silver. He also allowed him to settle anywhere in his land. Abraham prayed to God for Abimelech, and God restored Abimelech's ability to have children. When Abraham was 100 years old, Sarah gave birth to Isaac, or Yitzhak in Jewish terms. Yitzhak means he will love in Hebrew. So Isaac's name was given to him because Sarah laughed when God told her that she would give birth to a child when she was already barren. Sarah asked Abraham to drive Hagar, an Egyptian woman, and her son Ishmael away from Abraham. Abraham did not want to, but God told him to obey Sarah. So Abraham drove them out. Then God promised both Abraham and Hagar again that a great nation would come from Ishmael. This trust and unquestioning faith with which Abraham does what God tells him, despite his own desires, is a very important point, as we will see. For then begins a story that has been given special attention by some European philosophers, especially by the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, because this story is an example of the clash between moral human norms and God's command. This story is about the sacrifice of Isaac. God, as it is told in the book of Genesis, tested Abraham. One day the Lord told the old man to take his son Isaac, go to the land of Moriah and sacrifice Isaac, his beloved son, as a burnt offering. The Bible doesn't give much detail about the episode, nor does it say anything about Abraham's suffering. It only says that the next morning Abraham took wood, a donkey, his son and servants, and went to Moriah. Only on the third day did they reach the appointed place. Here, the philosopher I mentioned, Søren Kierkegaard, draws attention to the point. Imagine a father walking for 3 days to the appointed place, thinking that God had ordered his son to be sacrificed. The son himself knew nothing. When they arrived, Abraham told his servants to stay behind, and he went up the mountain with Isaac, a knife, and some wood to the place where the sacrifice was to be made. Isaac asked why they hadn't brought a lamp to sacrifice. Abraham replied that God would find a lamp for them. So Abraham went up the mountain and built an altar, laid out some wood, tied his son up, and laid him on the wood. Then he reached out with the knife to slaughter Yitzhak. I will return again to Kierkegaard. In his book Fear and Trembling, he discusses whether the sacrifice of Yitzhak can be called a murder. He writes that from an ethical point of view, it is undoubtedly murder. But at the same time, in doing God's will, Abraham transcends the ethical for a higher purpose. But let's go back to Abraham. At the moment he brought the knife over Yitzhak, God suddenly appeared in the form of an angel and told him not to kill his son, because now he saw that Abraham was God-fearing and did not withhold his son from God. At that moment, Abraham saw a ram nearby, and Abraham sacrificed the ram instead of Yitzhak. Then God tells Abraham again that his offspring will be as numerous as the stars in the sky or the sand on the seashore. In the Old Testament, there is no mention of how Abraham or Yitzhak felt before, during, or after the sacrifice. The Qur'an also contains this story, but Abraham sacrificed Ishmael, not Yitzhak. At the same time, the son himself agrees to be sacrificed if God wishes so. Let's go back to our story. Then Abraham's wife Sarah died at the age of 127. Abraham buried her and decided it was time to find a wife for his son Yitzhak. Abraham did not want to look for a bride in the land of the Canaanites, but he didn't want Yitzhak to go back to Abraham's homeland either, because God had promised them the land they were living in now. So Abraham sent his servant to Mesopotamia to look for his daughter-in-law. When Abraham's servant Eliezer arrived in Mesopotamia with gifts, he asked God to give him a sign about the woman he should choose. And the sign should be as follows. Eliezer will ask to get water, and the woman who gives him water and offers to give it to the camels is the one he will choose. And the very first girl Eliezer met turned out to be such a woman. She was Rebekah, the daughter of Abraham's nephew Bethuel. The servant told her relatives who he was and why he had come to Mesopotamia, and the relatives agreed to give Rebekah away, and Rebekah agreed to go with Eliezer. When Rebekah arrived in the land of Abraham, she met Isaac and they were married. And as it is written, through this, Isaac was comforted in his longing for his dead mother. Abraham then married again to a woman named Keturah. By her, he had 6 more sons. All of them in turn became the ancestors of various nations. These words from the Old Testament are interpreted as the fulfillment of the prophecy that Abraham would become the father of many nations. Abraham gave all he had to Isaac, gave his other sons concubines and gifts, and sent them to the east. When Abraham died at the age of 175, Isaac and Ishmael buried him next to Sarah in Hebron. This story is common to both Jews and Christians because it is told in the Old Testament, which is the Jewish Tanakh. In the New Testament, although Abraham is mentioned many times, no new details of Abraham's life story appear. Or even if they do appear in some parables, they do not change the story told in the Old Testament. Muslims have a slightly different idea of Abraham because it is based on the stories told in the Qur'an. Abraham or Ibrahim, according to Islam, is mentioned in the Qur'an many times in different surahs. One of the surahs, Surah number 14, is named after him. The outline of the story in the Qur'an is similar to the Old Testament story. Ibrahim and his nephew Lut leave Mesopotamia for the land of future Judah and then go to Egypt. There, Ibrahim pretends that Sarah is his sister, not his wife, and Sarah gives Ibrahim her maid to bear his children. Similarly, the birth of Isaac becomes a gift and a miracle from God. But there are significant differences. Some of them we have already mentioned, such as the fact that Abraham is going to sacrifice Ishmael, not Isaac. The Quran also says that Ibrahim and his son Ismail, its Ishmael names in Arabic, built Kaaba in Mecca, and that Hajar in Arabic, moved there after Sarah asked her husband to expel her. The Quran says that Abraham was neither Jewish nor Christian, but a Hanif, a person who professes monotheism. Muslims believe that the Prophet Muhammad revived this pure Abrahamic monotheism. This is the story of the central figure that unites the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. If you have not yet seen my video about the history of the Abrahamic religions, please click on the link in the video description. I hope you learned something new from this video. If so, please leave a comment. Let me know if the information in this format is clear to you, and write what books have you read and would recommend to others about Abraham. Also write what videos would you like to see here on this channel. Please like and subscribe to the channel. It will motivate me to make new episodes. See you soon. Bye.